again. This is Scott Johnson, aka Dad on Rails, and I find myself trapped in a car for a long drive, and my son today has asked me about Activerecord in the Rails context, and I thought that I would record a podcast or a video blog or YouTube or whatever the hell they call these things about that. So a couple things. As you may be able to tell, I'm wearing my Big Damn Hero t-shirt, which is one of the favorite t-shirts my wonderful wife has ever given me. And, alright, so let's start and talk about Activerecord. So Activerecord is one of those things that in Rails, if you're working with a relational database, you pretty much either can't get around or don't want to get around. Okay? And I will admit that while I have had some problems with Activerecord over the years, I am a damn fan. Okay, Activerecord is one of the single best parts of Ruby on Rails. Okay, so what is it? Activerecord is what's called a database abstraction layer. And what an abstraction layer is when you want to do something in software and you don't want to talk directly to the thing, whether that's a database or a screen or a CPU cache or something, you put in what's called an abstraction layer. An abstraction layer is just a bit of code that sits between your application and the thing you want to talk to. Okay? And you will find abstraction layers everywhere in software, and there's a famous quote saying that there's no problem in computing that cannot be solved by inserting an abstraction layer. Okay. So Activerecord sits between your application and the database. Now, there's a couple things that means. The first thing that it means is that theoretically, when you use Activerecord, you can change the underlying database. So you can have an application that runs on Postgres and then change it to running on MySQL by nothing more than going into config/database.yaml, which is just a text configuration file, and changing the database adapter from Postgres to MySQL. Now, you can do that. You probably almost certainly will not do that. And one of the reasons is that the abstraction layer that Activerecord offers is solid, but it is not fully complete. So here's an example of what I mean by that. There are fundamental differences between databases and how they function. A very good example is that in MySQL, queries against a text field are case insensitive. So in other words, I can specify Johnson in all uppercase or Johnson in all lowercase, and it will find all records that have Johnson as a last name. Postgres, unless you specifically do something else, will not do that. Postgres will find only capital J, small o, small j, small n, small s, small o, small n. And yes, that stutter there was my not being able to remember how to spell my own last name, because I don't really like being on video. I make these as an act of love for my child. Anyway, so the abstraction layer doesn't claim to be perfect. It basically, the way to think of it is it's a communications abstraction. You can talk to Postgres and you can talk to MySQL with the same commands, but what the databases themselves do with those commands, that will vary. Okay. So we are going to revert back to our canonical example, which we established early on was a product model. So basically, we're going to have a product model, okay, and it's going to have a couple of columns in it. Let's, for right now, call the columns name and price and description. So name will be a string column. Price would be, you might think float, but in reality you want to define that as a decimal parentheses, say 8,2, which basically means 8 numbers of total precision and 2 numbers in the decimal place. And description will be a text field. And then we'll have one other column which is called active, and that will be a Boolean. Okay. The terror of driving on the highway and seeing a state cop behind you, and he's pulling past me, and I am not speeding, and he is happily going on his way. I feel good about this. All right. Okay. So let's talk about so let's assume that you've got a table in your database. The table is called products because the active record convention is that your model is singularly named and your table is plurally named. And this is a deliberate choice by the designers of Rails to make your queries look more intelligible, and it's the right choice. And if you think that means that I hew to the Joe Selko approach to naming stuff that I learned back in the 90s from InfoWorld, yes, I do. All right, so you've got a products table. It's got some products in it. Let's say that we want to get back all of our products. How would you do that with Activerecord? Well, the easiest way is you'd have a controller. And remember, the controller is the thing that responds to RESTful actions. And in this case, it would probably be an index action because you're looking for everything. And that controller would say product.all, capital P product, because you're referring to the model, period, all. And what that's going to give you is that's going to give you every product, okay? Now, that's not going to give you a paginated set. You do those differently, and that's actually not a part of Activerecord. That's usually a separate third party, what's called a gem. But, so what does product.all give you? Let's say there's 10 products in the database, and the first one is aardvark, and the second one is cat, and the third one is zebra, and the fourth one is bird. That's going to give us an array, or actually technically an Activerecord collection, right? But it looks and feels like an array because Activerecord itself is an abstraction layer, right? I'm just going to go aardvark, cat, zebra, bird, okay? And the first thing you're going to say is, oh crap, that's wrong, it's not sorted. Very first thing everyone says. And my answer to you is no, it's not wrong. The Activerecord is a piece of software. Software, generally speaking, does what you tell it to do. And what this piece of software is doing is it is retrieving information from the database in an order which is following what's referred to as the primary key of the data. The primary key in Activerecord is, generally speaking, an auto-incrementing ID. So in other words, it has a column named ID, and that ID value is an integer, and it just goes up by 1 every time. First thing you put into the product gets an ID of 1, second thing 2, third thing 3, fourth thing 4. This, of course, assumes you don't delete anything because IDs are not actually reused. That's deliberate. It's a deliberate design constraint on the database, and it's usually the right constraint. Okay, so now what you're saying is, aha, this is wrong. I must fix this. How would you fix this? Well, I had said that you got the data back in all the data back by doing product.all. And you can do that, but what you really want to do is do product.order. Okay? And now order brings in the first Activerecord concept, which is that of a clause. So when you write, and bear in mind, underneath the hood, all Activerecord is doing ever, or almost always, is writing SQL statements for you. So when you say product.order, you have to tell it what you're going to order by. And in this case, we're going to have product.order, parentheses, quote, name, space, ASC, quote, parentheses. And what that tells Activerecord is, I want everything in the database, and I want it ordered by the name in ascending order. And because this is a string column, it's going to interpret that as I'm going to order it by the name, A to Z, so that's going to get, and I cannot remember, aardvark, cat, something between cat and zebra, because I can't remember my own damn name, apparently. Okay. All right, so and if you want to reverse it and have zebra at the top, you just change the ASC to DESC. And as you've known any SQL, you know that ASC and DESC are standard SQL constructs. Because again, under the hood, Activerecord is really building SQL for you, and you can inject little bits of SQL to make things better if you want. Okay. Now, if you notice, I did not use product.all.order, I used product.order. The reason for that is there is an implicit .all constraint when you use order. Okay? So basically, if you just have the word product in a controller, it's not going to do anything. So it's just a reference to the class. But when you have a an active record clause like order or where or find, it's going to inject, it perhaps will sometimes inject other things. And this may be a little bit described as Rails magic, maybe, but active record is outstanding. Okay, so we are 10 minutes and 39 seconds in. I'm going to be making these podcasts shorter, these videos shorter, because I have the missing video 5, which I cannot upload to YouTube because it's too damn long. So I'll go about 15 minutes, then stop it, do another one, etc. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the next, sort of the inverse here. So if order gives you everything, what gives you one thing? Okay? And there are 2 ways to do this. Okay. So the first way to do this is product.find parentheses ID. So if you remember I said everything has an implicit auto-incrementing ID. So if we wanted to find that first record in our system, product.find parentheses 1. Okay? This is probably my single least favorite active record command. Product.find1 has caused me no end of trouble. And I know a bunch of people out there are saying, but Scott, it's the simplest command ever. It takes one argument and just does a select. This is perfect. How can you have a problem with this? Well, I can have a problem with almost anything. And here's why. So I have done a lot of work over the years as a consultant. And when you come in as a consultant, sometimes you're lucky enough to do what's called greenfield development, which is where you start from scratch. And sometimes you come in and you pick up an existing code base, warts and all. And the way .find works is .find works by throwing an exception if it can't find the underlying thing. An exception is basically a term for stop the world or stop the thing by throwing a top-level error, okay, or a high-level error when it can't be found. And sometimes Rails applications will have global error handlers, which aren't always implemented all that correctly, and you call a .find call, the data can't be found, because data often can't be found, and then your Rails app can go insane, and trying to figure that the hell out is pain in the neck. I have at times been locked in debugging hell just because of an errant .find call. So, you say, what would we do if we don't use .find? You would use .where parentheses ID colon space in ID parentheses .first. It's more verbose. But the nice thing about .where parentheses ID colon number parentheses .first is it doesn't throw a damn exception. And yes, you can always rescue exceptions. I get that. So you'd rescue active record not found, I think is the exception. And it works, etc. But you don't usually think to do it. And because you assume you just looked up the data, if you use a .find call, it must be there, right? Well, big systems, sometimes there's admin tools, other people are deleting stuff as you're adding, as you're writing stuff, as you're finding stuff, etc. Or the problem that other people have put in, global error handlers that you're not aware of. All right, so we are at 14 and a half minutes, so we're going to recap now. So, what is Activerecord? Activerecord is an abstraction layer that sits between your code and the database. Activerecord is a light abstraction layer that doesn't isolate you from functional differences in how the database works. Okay? That said, Activerecord is a fantastically easy way to talk to a relational database. I have used it both in a Rails context and not a Rails context, and As long as you understand what the hell it's doing, it is a phenomenally useful tool. Thus ends part 1 of Active Record, and now I will stop this and resume it.